Donald Trump's replacing the UN now, right? That's what you're seeing people shout right now as he's now launched his new so-called Board of Peace at the World Economic Forum in Davos, with several world leaders signing a charter describing an organization that really completely is unlike what was originally proposed, which was an already controversial temporary body meant to oversee the rebuilding of Gaza. In fact, it was actually the UN Security Council that adopted a resolution endorsing the establishment of the so-called Board of Peace, and it described the board as a transitional administration in Gaza with a 2-year mandate to start. Now, the board's charter, it makes no direct reference to Gaza at all, instead describing itself as an international organization that seeks to promote stability, restore dependable and lawful governance, and secure enduring peace in areas affected or threatened by conflict. And in the signing ceremony today, where Trump claimed that the world is already richer, safer, and much more peaceful than it was just 1 year ago, he also claimed that the board would become one of the most consequential bodies ever created. And then adding that it will be the most prestigious board ever, it's going to get a lot of work done that the United Nations should have done, and saying,
once this board is completely formed, we can do pretty much whatever we want to do.
Now with that, I do want to note that he technically followed up by saying, we'll do it in conjunction with the United Nations, but that doesn't exactly inspire confidence, especially given how often and how strongly he's criticized the UN, and that's without mentioning that earlier this month, he moved to withdraw the United States from 66 international organizations described as contrary to the interests of the United States. And many of those were UN-related bodies dealing with issues like climate, labor, and migration. And on Tuesday, he straight up said that he thought that this Board of Peace might replace the UN. Although again, yes, it's Trump, he's often saying two things at the same time. He sort of walked it back saying, you got to let the UN continue because the potential is so great. But still, you're seeing people like an international law professor at Cambridge University saying this is a direct assault on the United Nations. This initiative is likely to be seen as a takeover of the world order by one individual in his own image. And they're right, this is being set up so that Trump just runs the show. Where both the UN resolution and the charter names Trump as chair, and the charter gives him the power to veto decisions, approve the agenda, invite members, dissolve the board entirely, and designate his own successor. And on the topic of succession, it's possible that Trump could hold the chair position for the rest of his life, even after leaving the presidency, or with a U.S. official saying the chairmanship can be held by President Trump until he resigns it. But adding a future U.S. president, however, may choose to appoint or designate the United States' representative to the board. Also, regarding who's on this board, while Trump has claimed that this is the greatest board ever assembled and everyone wants to be on it, the reality is that many countries, they're just not enthusiastic about it. Right? One, while Trump said that the board has the backing of 59 countries, only 19 countries were actually represented at the signing ceremony. And so far, it seems like 25 countries have publicly accepted, including Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Argentina, and Indonesia, just to name a few. But also two, very notably, no major European allies have made a commitment yet, and some have just outright rejected the idea, including French President Emmanuel Macron. A move that then led to Trump threatening France with a 200% tariff on wine from the country. But with that, I'll say, some Europeans are on board, but it's also, so far, at least a certain kind of European. Right? Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has signed on. He's something of a Trump-style strongman himself, as well as President of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, who is also known as Europe's last dictator, and he's a close ally of Putin. And actually, on the note of Russia, they received an invitation, with Trump actually claiming yesterday that Putin had accepted, but Putin has clarified that he has not, and the Kremlin is still studying the proposal. And you're seeing the involvement of Belarus and possibly Russia being why you had Zelensky saying that he was unsure if Ukraine could accept the invitation. As far as Trump, he defended his decision to include them, and other countries considered to be autocratic, telling reporters, I have some controversial people on it, but these are people that get the job done. These are people that have tremendous influence. Trump yesterday even said sometimes you need a dictator. A very normal statement from the President of the United States, a position that is usually thought of as like the leader of the free world. So again, many of the world's most influential countries, at least so far, they're not taking part, including not only the biggest powers in Europe, but also countries like Brazil, China, India, and Japan. There's also been a lot of talk about the membership, because apparently that's flexible, right? Because the charter says that nations that accept the invitation will be given a 3-year membership term. But the permanent membership, that'll only be given to member states that contribute more than $1 billion in cash to the Board of Peace within the first year. But with that, you had U.S. officials claiming that technically membership does not carry any mandatory funding obligation. They're saying that if member states choose to contribute money, the Board of Peace will implement the highest financial controls and oversight mechanisms. With that, it's not clear if anyone's opting for the paid tier so far, though I will say Putin has floated the idea of paying it with Russian assets that are frozen in the United States. And so also, it's still not entirely clear where the money is going to come from for rebuilding Gaza. Because even though Trump's so-called Board of Peace apparently has loftier ambitions, this is still seemingly its focus for now. And you actually had Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner laying out a $25 billion plan for doing so at the signing ceremony this morning. With Kushner saying the next 100 days will focus on increasing aid deliveries and rehabilitating essential infrastructure, including water, electricity, and sewage systems, and reconstructing hospitals and bakeries. But then he also presented what's been described as a master plan that would turn Gaza into a futuristic tech and industry hub with skyscrapers and coastal resorts. And Kushner is saying that the White House wants to bring free market economy principles to Gaza, reflecting the same mindset and same approach that he says that Trump's implementing in the States. But of course, while the people in charge here, they seem to see this as a big real estate opportunity, it's not clear that this is best for the people of Gaza. And the Palestinians, they seem to have little say. There's supposed to be a technocratic governing committee made up of Palestinians, but it's at the bottom of the hierarchy. And for now, the situation in Gaza, it remains extremely dire, and the violence, it hasn't totally subsided. Since the ceasefire began in October, you've had both sides accusing each other of violations. Israel saying Hamas has delayed returning a final body of a dead hostage, and Hamas saying that Israel has continued to restrict aid into Gaza despite an ongoing humanitarian disaster. Also, you've had Reuters investigating and finding that Israel's violated the ceasefire by moving the yellow line dividing Gaza deeper into the territory, destroying buildings and displacing Palestinians in the process. Also, that's as Israeli strikes have killed hundreds of Palestinians over the past few months, and in fact, just yesterday, Israeli forces reportedly killed at least 11 Palestinians in Gaza, including two 13-year-old boys and 3 journalists. Ultimately, we're in this situation where you have people saying, a bunch of world leaders and real estate developers calling themselves the board of peace. It doesn't make it so. And the whole thing, it seems especially ironic given Trump's recent action in Venezuela and the threats to take over Greenland. Although yesterday you did have Trump threatening, but then also saying that he wouldn't use force in Greenland. And then he also dropped his threat to impose new tariffs on several European allies as he claimed that he and the head of NATO had formed the framework of a future deal with respect to Greenland and, in fact, the entire Arctic region. And then today you had Trump saying on Fox News that the deal essentially grants total access with no time limit. And then with that, you've had the New York Times reporting that there are at least 3 main proposals on the table. 1, a major new NATO mission in the Arctic. 2, restrictions on non-NATO countries, especially Russia and China, mining Greenland's rare earth minerals. And 3, an update to a 1951 pact between the United States and Denmark that basically already allows the American military to do whatever it wants in Greenland. But apparently the concern is that if Greenland gained independence, that it would threaten that access. So allegedly what's on the table is giving the United States sovereignty over pockets of Greenland's territory, basically meaning that these areas would be considered American territory. But, and that's a big BBL, but things are far from set in stone. And actually, you had Zelensky slamming European leaders today in his speech at Davos over their handling over the whole situation.
It seems like everyone is just waiting for America to cool down on this topic, hoping it will pass away. But what if will not? What then? Today, Europe relies only on the belief that if danger comes, NATO will act. But no one has really seen the alliance in action. If Putin decides to take Lithuania or strike Poland, who will respond? Europe needs to know how to defend itself. And if you send 30 or 40 soldiers to Greenland, what is that for? What message does it send?
Now, with all that, a very big thing is that he avoided criticizing Trump, and he actually kind of suggested that Europe should be more like Trump in terms of taking action, right? Raising the possibility that they could seize Russian oil tankers the way that Trump's done with Venezuela. And in fact, before that speech, you had Zelensky meeting with Trump, and it was a conversation that both leaders described as good without giving too much detail. But also, you did have Trump envoy Steve Witkoff, who's also deeply involved in the Gaza stuff, saying, I think we've got it down to one issue, and we have discussed iterations of that issue, and that means it's solvable. So with that, he's headed off to Moscow with Jared Kushner to meet Putin, and there are now supposed to be trilateral talks involving the United States, Ukraine, and Russia in the UAE on Friday and Saturday.